For 230 years, millions of visitors walked past a single wall in Pompeii without knowing what it contained. The corridor connecting the ancient theater district to Via Stabiana had been excavated in 1794, catalogued multiple times, and declared complete. Experts had moved on. There was nothing left to find. But that wall was lying. Scratched into its plaster were messages that had waited nearly 2,000 years to be read. Love notes, gladiator portraits, crude insults, even a prayer from a slave woman begging Venus for a chance at happiness. Not lost to time, hidden in plain sight, invisible to the naked eye, waiting for light to reveal them in just the right way. What finally exposed these hidden voices wasn't a new excavation. It was a camera, a dome of lights, and the realization that the most documented archaeological site on Earth had been keeping secrets from us all along. Pompeii sits in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, about 23 kilometers southeast of Naples. On an August morning in 79 AD, the volcano erupted without warning, sending a column of superheated gas and rock fragments 20 kilometers into the sky. Within hours, ash began falling on the city like gray snow. By nightfall the following day, Pompeii had vanished beneath 6 meters of volcanic debris. Buildings, streets, bodies, even loaves of bread on shop counters, all frozen in place, sealed in an accidental time capsule that would remain undisturbed for 17 centuries. When systematic excavations began in the mid-18th century, archaeologists quickly noticed something unusual. The walls were covered in writing, not official inscriptions carved by craftsmen, but informal scratchings made by ordinary people, messages to friends, political endorsements, sexual boasts, love declarations, bathroom humor. Someone had scratched "I was here" into a brothel wall. Another had recorded the price of bread at a nearby bakery. A third had drawn a crude portrait of a gladiator they'd watched fight in the arena. Over the following 2.5 centuries, scholars documented more than 11,000 individual pieces of graffiti across Pompeii. It became the largest collection of ancient handwritten messages ever discovered, an archive of everyday Roman life that no literary text could provide. Senators and poets wrote for posterity. Ordinary people wrote because they were bored, or in love, or angry, or simply wanted someone to remember they existed. But not everyone valued what they found. The 19th century German archaeologist August Mau expressed a common attitude when he wrote that graffiti came from people with whom we should least desire to come into contact. The messages seemed trivial, low class, unworthy of serious scholarship. For generations, ancient graffiti was recorded but rarely studied in depth. Scholars copied what they could see, filed it away, and turned their attention to temples and mosaics. The theater corridor, a covered passageway stretching 27 meters from the theater complex to one of Pompeii's main commercial streets, held the densest concentration of graffiti in the entire city. This made sense. The corridor sat between the large theater, which seated 5,000 spectators, and the smaller Odeon next door. After performances, crowds poured through this narrow passage on their way to shops and taverns along Via Stabiana. People waited here. They lingered. They scratched messages into the plaster while killing time. 19th century excavators noted the messages when they uncovered the corridor in 1794, recorded what they could see, and moved on. Later teams returned with better documentation methods. By the 20th century, the theater corridor was considered one of the most thoroughly studied graffiti surfaces in the ancient world. What they couldn't see was how much they were missing. The problem wasn't carelessness, it was physics. When someone scratches a message into wet plaster, they create a shallow groove, typically less than a millimeter deep. The stylus pushes material aside, leaving a tiny channel with slightly raised edges. In fresh plaster, these grooves are obvious. Light hits the surface, catches the edges, casts small shadows that make each letter legible. But time erodes everything. Pompeii's buildings stood exposed to Mediterranean weather for 1,700 years before excavation began. Sun baked the plaster. Rain dissolved its surface. Wind carried abrasive dust. The sharp edges of carved letters softened into gentle undulations. By the time archaeologists arrived, many inscriptions had already faded to near invisibility. Excavation made things worse. Once uncovered, the theater corridor spent another 230 years exposed to the elements. Tourists brushed against the walls. Humidity fluctuated with the seasons. The grooves that survived the eruption continued their slow disappearance. Eventually, the scratches became so shallow that ambient light simply washed over them without casting shadows. To the human eye, the wall looks blank. Early archaeologists worked with oil lamps, candles, and eventually electric lights. They photographed surfaces straight on, in even illumination. It was standard practice for documentation, but a standard failure for graffiti detection. Flat lighting reveals color and texture, yet it erases the subtle topography that makes faded inscriptions visible. Some researchers tried raking light, positioning a lamp at a sharp angle to cast longer shadows. This helped, but it only revealed what was visible from one direction. A groove running east-west might appear clearly under light from the north, but vanish completely under light from the east. Without checking every possible angle, inscriptions remained hidden. No one had the time. No one thought to ask whether the walls had been speaking all along in a frequency of light we hadn't learned to hear. In 2022, researchers from Sorbonne University in Paris and the University of Quebec in Montreal arrived at the theater corridor with a different approach. Louis Hautain and Héloïse Letellier-Taillefer, working alongside Marie-Adeline Le Guenec, had designed a project they called Bruits de couloir, French for corridor whispers. Their tool was Reflectance Transformation Imaging, a computational photography method developed originally by Hewlett-Packard Labs in 2001 and refined over 2 decades for cultural heritage applications. The principle is simple. The execution is painstaking. RTI captures dozens of photographs of the same surface, each lit from a different angle. A dome-mounted array of lights fires sequentially, sometimes 50 or more directions, while the camera remains fixed in position. A small reflective sphere placed in each frame allows software to calculate the precise angle of illumination for every shot. Each photograph captures the way shadows fall across the surface when illuminated from one specific position in the hemisphere above. Software then combines these images into an interactive file. The viewer can virtually relight the surface from any angle, watching shadows shift and stretch as if moving a flashlight across the wall. Shallow grooves that cast no shadow under overhead light suddenly appear when lit from the side. Details invisible at noon become vivid at dawn. The team divided the 27-meter corridor into a virtual grid, marking each section for systematic documentation. They set up their equipment in the cramped passageway, camera on tripod, reflective spheres positioned carefully, portable lighting rig aimed at the ancient plaster. They captured image after image, adjusting angles by degrees, building a complete record of how light interacted with every square centimeter of surface. Then they processed thousands of photographs through RTI software, and they started to see letters. Where the corridor walls had appeared smooth, scratched Latin emerged. Where scholars had recorded partial inscriptions, complete sentences appeared. Where nothing seemed to exist, faces took shape, detailed sketches of gladiators, carefully rendered, despite being scratched with whatever sharp implement the artist had at hand. By the time the team completed a second field campaign in 2025, they had documented approximately 300 individual inscriptions across the corridor walls. Around 200 had been previously recorded, though many could now be read more completely than ever before. But 79 inscriptions had never been identified at all, hidden for 230 years. walked past by millions of tourists, finally visible because someone changed the angle of the light. What did these voices say? Among the newly revealed inscriptions was a faint sketch of two gladiators locked in combat, not crude stick figures but detailed poses showing combat stances, weapons held at realistic angles, helmets and armor carefully indicated. The artist had watched real fights. They knew how bodies moved in the arena. Nearby, another scratching reads, "Erato loves, before the plaster crumbles away, leaving the beloved's name forever unknown." Erato was a common name given to female slaves and freedwomen in ancient Rome. Whoever wrote those words may have been property. Their love was real enough to carve into stone. Some messages are coarser. One newly legible insult reads, "Michio, chio, chio, you broke your father's stomach while he was defecating. Look how Michio is." A 2,000-year-old bathroom joke preserved by ash and revealed by sophisticated imaging technology. The Romans, it turns out, had the same sense of humor we do. Others are unexpectedly tender. A previously known inscription, now readable in full context, records the words of Methe, a slave from the town of Atella. Methe, slave of Cominia of Atella, loves Chresto in her heart. May the Venus of Pompeii be favorable to both of them, and may they always live in harmony. This is not political propaganda, not official history. This is a woman who is legally slave, who could be sold or separated from everyone she loved at her owner's whim, asking a goddess for permission to be happy. She signed her status, slave, into her prayer. She wanted the divine record to be accurate. The theater corridor sat between Pompeii's two theaters and a busy commercial street. It functioned like a highway on-ramp, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. They stopped to scratch their names, their jokes, their hopes, not because the wall was sacred, but because they were waiting, and the plaster was soft, and they wanted to leave something behind. Technology is the key that opens new rooms of the ancient world. Gabriel Zuchtriegel, director of the Pompeii Archaeological Park, said when the findings were announced. He noted that the city's more than 10,000 known inscriptions form an immense heritage, but one that remains incomplete. How many walls have been declared finished that still hold secrets? The discovery forces an uncomfortable question. What else have we been looking at without seeing? Reflectance. Transformation. Imaging has been available for more than 2 decades. Archaeologists have used it on coins, cuneiform tablets, rock art, and medieval manuscripts. The Smithsonian has employed it to study fragile paper artifacts. Classicists have applied it to faded inscriptions at Herculaneum, Pompeii's smaller neighbor. But applying RTY systematically to Pompeii's already documented surfaces is relatively new. The theater corridor was chosen precisely because it was considered complete, a test case for whether modern methods could extract new information from exhaustively studied sites. 79 new inscriptions proved they could. Now the team is developing a 3D platform that will combine RTY data with photogrammetry and epigraphic metadata, allowing future researchers to examine every graffito in its spatial context. The Pompeii Archaeological Park has announced plans to build a protective roof over the corridor to slow further erosion. The clock is running. Every year of exposure means more fading, more loss, more voices slipping into silence. But the larger implication reaches beyond one passageway. If the most studied wall in the most studied archaeological site in history was hiding 79 messages, how many remain hidden elsewhere? Pompeii's 11,000 known inscriptions may represent only a fraction of what was originally written. Every exposed surface that has weathered for centuries could contain words we lack the methods or the patience to reveal. The technology exists. The question is whether we choose to apply it. And the voices themselves matter. For most of history, We have learned about the Roman world through texts written by elite men, senators, poets, emperors. The poor, the enslaved, and most women left no formal literary record. Official inscriptions commemorated the powerful. But ordinary people scratched messages on walls. They signed their names. They declared their loves. They made crude jokes about their neighbors. Classical epigraphist Rebecca Benefiel, who leads the Ancient Graffiti Project at Washington and Lee University, has spent years documenting Pompeii's handwritten inscriptions. The graffiti were basically ignored because, as one scholar put it, the graffiti are not written by the kind of people we are most interested in meeting, she has observed. That dismissal preserved a bias for generations, the assumption that everyday voices were unworthy of scholarly attention. RTI doesn't just reveal letters, it reveals people. Today, the theater corridor stands exposed to the air as it has since 1794, its plaster slowly fading under weather and time. The protective roof is planned but not yet built. Tourists walk past, phones in hand, looking for something more obviously spectacular. They don't know that beneath the apparent blankness, messages wait, some already recovered, others still hidden, all of them fragile. Somewhere on that wall, faint scratches that may not survive another century still hold messages we have not yet learned to read. A name, a joke, a hope for happiness, a prayer from someone who owned nothing, not even herself, asking for love. The technology exists. The question is whether we choose to look, and how many voices we are willing to hear from 2,000 years ago that sound uncomfortably like our own. What do you think?